There is a particular kind of heat that people who grew up before air conditioning understand in their bones, not just warm air, but thick, pressing, almost living heat that settled into the house by noon and refused to leave until well past midnight. And yet somehow, in neighborhoods from Georgia to Ohio to the Central Valley of California, families not only survived those summers, they built some of their most cherished memories inside them. Tonight we are going back to find out exactly how they did it. 9 ways families stayed cool before the window unit hummed its way into every bedroom, counted down to the one memory that, if you lived it, you have never once forgotten. Number 9. The icebox and the man who brought it. Before the refrigerator became a fixture in every kitchen, and even in the years when refrigerators were common, but ice was still cheaper, the icebox was the anchor of the summer kitchen. You remember the shape of it, usually a wood-framed cabinet with a zinc or tin-lined interior, a drip pan underneath that your mother reminded you every single morning not to let overflow. The Frigidaire electric refrigerator had been around since the 1920s, but well into the 1940s, and even the early 1950s in many rural and working-class households, families were still relying on delivered ice to keep their food cold. The ice delivery man came through neighborhoods on a schedule most families could set their watches by. He worked for companies like the American Ice Company or local operations that had been running since the horse and wagon days, and by the time you were old enough to remember him clearly, he was probably driving a truck with a canvas-draped back and tongs over his shoulder. The chips and slivers of ice that fell off the block as he carried it to your door were fair game for the neighborhood children. You pressed them against your wrists, your neck. You held them in your palm until your hand went numb and the coolness traveled up your arm like a gift. That small moment, a sliver of ice on a July morning, was a whole summer experience compressed into about 30 seconds. Number 8. The box fan in the window. If there is a single sound that belongs to a pre-air conditioning summer evening, it is the sound of a box fan, that steady, mechanical, slightly rattling hum that filled every room in the house from late May until September. The electric desk fan had been around since the turn of the century, but the box fan, as most families knew it, a square plastic or metal housing with a simple rotating blade mounted in a window frame, became widely affordable and widely used in American homes through the 1950s and 1960s. Brands like Emerson, General Electric, and Westinghouse made models that families bought at the hardware store or from a catalog, and then stationed with deliberate care at every cross-ventilating window they could find. The strategy mattered. You remember this, your father walking the house in the early evening, deciding which windows should pull air in and which should push it out, reading the breeze the way a sailor reads a sail. The south-facing windows might get the intake, the north side the exhaust. The fan in the hallway aimed to pull cool air up from the basement. It was a kind of domestic engineering performed every evening by ordinary people who had simply learned to work with the house rather than against it. And there was a whole ritual intelligence in it that got passed down from parents to children without anyone ever calling it a lesson. Number 7. The cool basement as a summer living room. Below every 2-story house with a proper foundation, there was another world in summer, darker, quieter, smelling of concrete and old wood and something faintly mineral, and 15 degrees cooler than the kitchen above. The basement in the 1940s and 1950s was not yet the finished rec room it would become in later decades. It was a working space, a utility space, a canning and storage space. But in the deep heat of July, families migrated down those stairs the way people seek shade under a tree, instinctively, gratefully, without much discussion. Mothers canned tomatoes down there and kept the heat of the stove from strangling the upstairs rooms. Children spread out on the concrete floor with comic books and cold glasses of water. Sometimes a card table got set up and the whole family played canasta or pinochle on a Saturday afternoon while the world cooked above them. The smell of a cool basement in summer is one of those sense memories that requires no translation for anyone who experienced it. You know the smell, that cool, slightly damp, slightly earthy air that hits you at the top of the stairs and pulls you down like a hand on your shoulder. Number 6. Running through the sprinkler. This one requires no explanation, but it deserves its words. The oscillating lawn sprinkler, the kind that swept back and forth across the grass in a long, arcing fan of cold water, was not primarily a toy. But it became one every summer afternoon in neighborhoods where children were left to make their own entertainment and the heat had pushed every other option off the table. The Melner Company and others made sprinklers that became fixtures on American lawns through the post-war decades, and the choreography of running through one was both completely improvised and somehow universal. You waited for the arc to swing away, you ran through the cold spray at the peak of its return, you screamed at the shock of the cold water, you did it again. You did it in your play clothes because there was no time to change into a swimsuit. You did it until the lawn was muddy and your mother called you in for supper with a particular sharpness in her voice that meant she was not going to call again. The grass smelled green and cut and a little metallic from the water, and the concrete walk you ran on was warm under your bare feet and the water was cold, and the afternoon went on the way summer afternoons did when you were young and time moved differently. Number 5. Lemonade on the porch. Do you remember the particular pleasure of a glass of lemonade that was made in a glass pitcher and set in the icebox until it was cold enough to frost the glass the moment the ice water hit the air? Not a mix, not a powder, but real lemons cut in half and pressed on a glass juicer, sugar dissolved in water on the stove. The whole thing assembled with a kind of unhurried domestic care that transformed the simple act of making a cold drink into a summer ritual. The porch was where the lemonade was consumed, and the porch was itself an institution. The covered front porch of the American home was a functional architectural feature that the post-war ranch house would slowly eliminate, but in the bungalows and craftsman homes and farmhouses where many of you grew up, the porch was as much a room of the house as the kitchen. There was a swing on a chain, or a glider, or at minimum a pair of wooden chairs. There was shade from the porch roof. There was the movement of air that the house itself couldn't provide. And there was the life of the street to watch, the neighbors passing, the children on bikes, the particular quality of a summer afternoon that you could only fully appreciate from a porch with something cold in your hand. Number 4. The evening drive with all the windows down. Families who owned an automobile in the 1950s and 1960s discovered something that required no explanation and no planning. That a car moving at 35 or 40 miles per hour with all 4 windows rolled down produced something very close to a breeze, and a breeze was all you needed on a July evening to feel almost completely human again. There was no destination required, though sometimes families ended up at a drive-in for ice cream, or at a root beer stand, or simply out on a road that followed a river or ran through the hills where the air was different. The car interior of that era contributed its own sensory texture, the smell of hot vinyl cooling, the sound of wind over the window frame at highway speed, the particular quality of evening light coming across fields or through the elm trees that still lined the streets of American towns before the Dutch elm disease took them. Children pressed their faces into the wind like dogs. Fathers drove with one arm on the window. Mothers held their hair with one hand and watched the landscape move. Nobody had anywhere to be. The cool air was enough. Number 3. The public pool and the swimming hole. Every town of any size had one, and every child knew the particular protocol that governed it. The municipal swimming pool, concrete, heavily chlorinated, crowded from the moment it opened until the lifeguard's whistle ended the day, was one of the central institutions of American childhood in the post-war decades. You remember the smell of the chlorine from half a block away. You remember the rough texture of the concrete pool deck against bare feet. You remember the weight of a wet towel over your shoulder and the particular exhaustion of a whole afternoon in the sun and the water. In rural areas and smaller towns, the swimming hole served the same function with a different character entirely, a bend in the creek or river where the water pooled deep enough and calm enough for swimming, where a rope swing might hang from a sycamore tree, where children and teenagers gathered without supervision in a way that seems almost unimaginable by later standards. The swimming hole required local knowledge. You had to be shown where it was, usually by an older child, and that passing down of knowledge was its own kind of community ritual. Number 2. The evening drive to nowhere in particular, and then the porch again. Actually, let us stop here and ask you something directly, because this is the moment in the memory that tends to unlock everything else. When you were a child in those summers, when the heat had pushed the whole household outside after supper, can you still picture the specific porch or yard or stoop where the adults gathered while the children ran in the last of the light? Can you still see who was sitting where, who was talking, the color of the sky, the sound of the cicadas? We want to hear about your street, your neighborhood, your family's particular version of this evening. Please tell us in the comments, because no two porches were exactly alike and every story is worth keeping. And now, number 1. The whole neighborhood outside after dark because inside was hotter. This is the one. This is the memory that people of a certain age carry around without always naming it. The long summer evenings when the heat inside the house was genuinely worse than the heat outside. And so the entire neighborhood migrated to the yards and porches and sidewalks after supper and simply stayed there until the air cooled enough to make sleeping possible. This was not a planned event. It required no organizing. It happened because thermodynamics and human nature aligned on every hot evening from Memorial Day to Labor Day, and the result, entirely unintentional, was one of the richest forms of community life that American neighborhoods would ever produce. You know what those evenings looked like. The men sat in lawn chairs or on the porch steps. The women moved between yards, visiting, or sat together on a glider. The older children ran games in the street, kick the can, hide and seek, games that used the whole block as their board. The younger children eventually fell asleep on blankets in the grass and got carried inside. The conversations were not about anything in particular: the garden, the neighbors, the news from the radio, the price of things at the A&P, nothing and everything at once. There was no pressure to the evening because no one had anywhere to be. The only thing on the agenda was waiting for the air to cool. What that casual, enforced togetherness built over the summers of the 1940s and 1950s and into the 60s is something that has been widely noted by people who study how communities form and hold together, not in surveys or statistics, but in memory. People who grew up on those streets remember their neighbors by name, remember the specific details of a dozen families' lives, feel the texture of those summer evenings as a kind of belonging that is difficult to fully describe. They did not choose community. They were placed into it by the heat. When air conditioning became affordable and widespread through the 1960s and into the 1970s, people went inside, first one household, then the next, then the whole street. The front porch began its long retreat. The evening conversations moved inside or disappeared altogether. Nobody made a decision to abandon the neighborhood evening. They simply found a more comfortable option and took it, the way anyone would. But something went with it that was genuinely worth mourning, and the people who remember it know that, even if they couldn't have named what they were losing at the time. The one thing worth taking from all of this is not a how-to and not a suggestion to turn off your air conditioning, but simply an invitation to notice that the discomfort that once pushed people together outside made certain kinds of connection almost unavoidable. We were all just out there on the same hot street, in the same warm evening, waiting for the same small mercy of a breeze. And in that waiting, we knew each other. Tell us in the comments about your family's summer, the porch, the pool, the fan in the window, the particular cold thing that got you through a July afternoon. These memories belong to all of us, and we are here to keep them.